Chapter 29 Away with Him The clatter of horses' hoofs on the flagged street called Paul and his friends out at dawn for the canter across the rolling plain and the climb among the hills of Samaria and Judea. Guided by some of the friends from Caesarea, they turned their faces to the rising sun and rode along the chariot way, passing the inns from whose courtyards the grumbling camels were striding out, and skirting the empty stadium, till the short tunnel of the gateway in the city wall led them out to the freshness of the open country. Through the day they travelled, climbing the hills, resting in the blazing summer noonday, and at sundown they came to the home of an old man who with glowing face welcomed the great leader Paul with his friends to his house. The old man's name was Mnason. He had been a disciple of Christ for long years, and like Barnabas he was a native of Cyprus. Next morning they said farewell to Mnason and breasted the hills again, till at last, as the shadow began to fall across the brook Kidron, they came out under the walls of Jerusalem. Paul found himself again in the city where he had dreamed dreams as a student. He forgot even the enemies who plotted against his life, when he saw the faces of the brothers in Jerusalem light with joy as he came among them. He would be glad, too, to see his nephew, the son of his sister, who lived in Jerusalem. Going along the familiar streets on the following morning, Paul saw the harvest thanksgiving preparations, the little sheaves of corn, the huts of branches on the rooftops recalling the old days when the Jews, wandering across the desert from Egypt, had neither harvest nor house. He entered the doorway of a house where in a large room the elders of the church in Jerusalem had already come together, with the Lord's brother James presiding. Paul courteously saluted them. Then he began to tell much of the story that we have read in this book. Imagine the glory of hearing it at first hand from the man to whom these adventures had really come. Quiet, conventional, stay-at-home men as they were, the elders were transported to a new world as they leaned forward with parted lips, chin on hand, listening to this flaming torch of a man, Paul, who had sped over sea and plain, through mountain pass and robber valley, beaten and stoned and starved, slaving with his hands before dawn and declaring his glorious message till after midnight. Singing in prison, rejoicing at the hard knocks of the world, the quickener of life in a score of cities and across half the known world, the untiring Jewish traveller, the free brave Roman citizen, the blazing Greek orator, the glad slave of Christ. Then Timothy of Lystra and Gaius of Derbe came forward with their gift from the churches upon the plateau of Galatia, Tychicus and Trophimus of Ephesus with the gift from Asia, and Aristarchus and Secundus from Macedonia, with Sopater of Berea, handed in their offering. As Paul ceased speaking and the gifts were offered, the elders broke out into thanks. " Glory be to God," they cried, " for these wonderful works through his servant Paul." Then the glow of the wide vision faded, and Jerusalem was about them again and the church in Jerusalem, still in many of its members trying to cramp Christ within the iron hoop of a single nation's destiny. " Brother," they said to him, " you see how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, all of them ardent upholders of the law. Now they have heard that you teach all Jews who live among the nations to break away from Moses and not to circumcise their children, nor to follow the old customs. What is to be done?" they went on. " They will be sure to hear you have arrived. So do as we tell you. We have 4 men here under a vow. Associate yourself with them. Purify yourself with them. Pay their expenses so that they may be free to have their heads shaved." These men had taken the Nazirite vow that they would not shave their heads till they had performed certain acts and purified themselves. " If you do that," said the elders to Paul, " everybody will understand that there is nothing in these stories about you, but that, on the contrary, you are yourself guided by reverence for the law. As for these believers among the nations, we have already sent out through you, in the letter signed by James, our decision that they must avoid food that has been offered on altars to idols, the taste of blood, flesh of animals that have been strangled, and unclean vice." Paul knew that the forms of ceremony in the temple were not the heart of worship of God. They were the ceremonies of one people. Yet with that all-embracing sweep of his passion for winning men, Paul consented to do as the elders suggested. On the very next day he began to carry out the act of purification for himself along with the 4 men. Paul went into the temple courts with the men. " I wish to join these men," he said, " and to pay their charges, till the vow is accomplished and till they can be freed from it." Day after day, and at Paul's expense, they each offered gifts of money and oil, a ram, a lamb, and cakes. On the 7th day they would have fulfilled all the ceremonies. But that 7th day never came for Paul. With crafty eyes his enemies watched him. They had seen him walking in the streets with Trophimus from Ephesus, to them a sinner of the Gentiles, a man without the law. They saw Paul go up the steps to the marble parapet where the great stone stood which said, " Let no foreigner enter within the screen and enclosure surrounding the sanctuary. Whoever is taken so doing will himself be the cause that death overtaketh him." Paul crossed the line and went through the opening. His bare feet were upon the marble of the Holy Court. The hour had come. The Jews from Asia were there, possibly some of those who had plotted his death 2 months earlier, when Paul was starting to sail from Corinth, and had been balked. They would not be foiled again. They dashed at him, gripped his mantle and raised a cry that thrilled the heart of Pharisee and Zealot alike. " To the rescue, men of Israel! Help! Help! Here is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against the chosen people, against the law of Moses, against this holy place. Help! Help!" To every quarter of the temple the cry rang out. Men dashed in from all sides to join in the defence. The cry rang across the roofs to the Roman castle by the temple, where the sentinel stood like a statue on the turret of Antony's tower. " He has brought Greeks inside the temple and defiled this holy place," cried the Jews from Asia. " To the rescue, men of Israel! Help!" Up the streets of the city the cry ran like wildfire. The Jews dashed into the temple, but they would not defile the sacred place by killing him there. " Out of the temple with him! " came the cry. Dragging, pushing, shouting, waving, the whole mob surged toward the gates and into the open place without. The gates of the temple enclosure swung to with a clang and were bolted. " Kill him ! Kill him !" cried the fanatics, some of them the men who had cried before Pilate, as Jesus Christ stood on trial 30 years earlier, " Crucify him! Crucify him!" and had yelled, " Stone him! Stone him! " in the hour of Stephen's death. They lifted their sticks and began to beat him furiously over the head and shoulders and back. But the sentinel on Antony's tower had already taken action. He sent down word to the commander of the garrison regiment, who rapped out an order, and in a few minutes with officers and men was hurrying to the spot. Dashing aside the mob, the company marched to the centre. The cry, " The soldiers are coming! " was raised. The staves were dropped and silence fell. " Who is he? " asked the commander, Lysias. " What has he done? " Some of the crowd roared one thing, some another. He could not learn the facts for the uproar. " Chain him," ordered Lysias. 2 chains were clasped on his wrists. At that moment Paul left the world of freedom. He never moved for years to come without the sound of the clank of his fetters in his ear. " Lead him to the citadel," ordered Lysias. Along the front of the temple and out under the shadow of the Roman tower they moved, the Jewish mob raging and yelling behind and around. They thronged upon Paul, clutching at his robe till the soldiers had actually to carry him. " Away with him! Away with the fellow from the earth! Away with him! " At last the soldiers reached the steps of the citadel. They were about to lead Paul to the cells in the barracks when he turned to the commander. " May I say a word to you? " he asked Lysias, speaking in Greek. " You know Greek," said the astonished commander. " Then you are not the Egyptian, who in days gone by raised the 4,000 assassins and led them out into the desert? "" I am a Jew," said Paul with quiet dignity, " a native of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. Pray let me speak to the people." Paul, bound as he was and bruised, stood forward on the top of the steps before the mob and began to speak to them in Hebrew, their own tongue. Something in the presence of that undaunted figure, and in the sound of that vibrant voice which had won the hearing of men in many lands, swept over that seething mob. A deep hush came on them, like the whisper and the silence that come over a field of corn as it sways to the breeze and then is still. " Brothers and fathers," he said, " listen to the defence I now make before you." When they heard him speaking in Hebrew they were all the more quiet. So he went on: " I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel in all the strictness of our ancestral law, ardent for God as you all are to day. I persecuted this way of religion to the death, chaining and imprisoning both men and women, as the high priest and all the council of elders can testify. It was from them that I got letters to the brotherhood at Damascus, and then journeyed thither to bind those who had gathered there and bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment.